Welcome to the flipped classroom on the Indian Ocean Basin. This series of flipped classrooms is going to focus on this basin as a whole rather than on the chapters individually because in a lot of ways these regions had more in common with each other than they did with their land-held neighbors. So the Swahili city-states had more in common with each other than they did with, let's say, Mali, or the coastal areas of India had more in common with each other, with the Swahili city-states, than they did with, let's say, like Tibet. Um, because they were trading with each other. Just look at that Indian Ocean basin, right? It includes such a vast amount of territory. South Asia, East Africa, the Middle East, including Persia, and Persia, and East Asia as well. So we're going to be looking at all of these areas. That covers chapters 13, 15, and 18. So here are your overarching themes and key concepts that deal with this section. The Indian Ocean Basin is, like I said, pretty big. It's vast and it's connected. It's an area of communication and exchange, not only of purposeful economic exchange, but of ideas, religions, etc. as well. The basin includes, like I said, East Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, China, Persia, which at this time was the Islamic, dominated by the Islamic caliphates, and India. And merchandise as well as religion, technology, and other ideas were exchanged. So, for example, silk and spices, as far as religions go, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam were three big ones that were exchanged. Technology like the compass and the astrolabe and ship technology was exchanged, and other ideas like credit, for example, were exchanged too. The big states, like parts of India and China, the Cholan Kingdom and the Sultanate of Delhi, influenced smaller states politically, culturally, economically, kind of like we discussed with China in terms of writing, religion, um, and culture, language in general. All of those things were influential to them. For example, in Angkor Wat, their king was called a Raja, which is the what people in South Asia or India call their kings. Um, on the whole, populations grew throughout the Indian Ocean basin because of new crops like fast-growing rice, which gave you 2 yields per year. Migrations from rural areas to cities, which is, urbanization, but also migrations from like Turkish migrations from Central Asia into places like South Asia. The key concepts that you should review before watching this or that you should be watching for when watching this, for examples, are 2.3 Roman numeral 2, 3.1 Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, 3.2 Roman numerals 2 and 3, and 3.3 Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. And pretty much this is really going to focus a lot on trade and the way trade and politics interact. Okay, so let's get started by looking at China. Since we already went, oh, excuse me, sorry, we've got to go over commonalities first. Geez, Miss Naylor. All right, so the commonalities, they were all experiencing urbanization. People were moving to cities in a big way for opportunities in trade and not only in trade, but to practice a trade, such as textiles or iron manufacturing. The connection between all these reasons is trade. I hope that's obvious to you. I've said it 3 times already in the first 4 minutes. And there was a lot of exchanges, this is also a common theme, of goods and flora and fauna and culture, like fast-growing rice and religions. Technology was something that these groups shared. So, for example, many in the western part of the Indian Ocean basin, particularly Arab traders, African traders, preferred to use this boat or something similar called a dhow. And over this time period, dhows increased in carrying capacity and technology from um, carrying about 100 tons to about 400 tons. Now, that is dwarfed by the preferred ship of East Asia, which is a junk. And these junks could carry up to 1,000 pounds of, or 1,000 tons of cargo. They were huge. So, this method of transport was incredibly efficient, especially for bulk goods. And religion was spread around this region not only through missionaries like Sufis, but also through merchants. And somewhat unsuccessfully, although successful for initial exposure, well, not successful for spreading religion, successful in terms of conquest, the military. So now let's look at China. China, like we learned in the earlier videos, was politically very centralized. If you're going to look at China versus India and Africa and use them as a comparison, the best difference is that China is centralized. Economically, they were extremely prosperous because they had a lot of new crops. Crops were being spread through the Dar al-Islam, but also they had crops like fast-growing rice. They were increasing their irrigation technology, and they also had new products like porcelain, paper money. Oh, you just kind of see this below. More production of steel and iron, gunpowder, movable type, all of these things. So that's resulting in things like books, right? So all of these innovations made either trade easier or were goods that people really wanted, like porcelain in particular. Right? We're going to learn about how silk technology was spreading, but porcelain was still where still a good China had that no one could figure out how to produce these pots that were these pots and dishes that were so amazing. Um, that's why sometimes they're called China. Socially, China continued to be extremely patriarchal, practicing foot binding, which is a practice that women did that made them very, mainly elites did, to make their feet teeny tiny, which made it very difficult for them to move long distances quickly, as you can imagine. We'll learn about that in class. There was a culture of urbanization. Xi'an became the largest city of the time, big trading port. And Buddhism was becoming prominent in China. That was the most important import. It jived really well with Taoism and Confucianism as well, because it was this path of moderation. And in China, remember, there's no exclusivity here. You can practice all of these things, which, by the way, that was what made people nervous about Buddhism, is they thought that this was going to be super exclusive. Um, Chinese officials went to India to learn about this Buddhism, and then they incorporated some Buddhist practice into Neo-Confucianism, into Confucianism, which is called Neo-Confucianism, which we will see in class. So that is it when it comes to China, except for that you should know that you should visualize this incredible growth in population in China, which is going to cause some instability and some rebellions. But on the whole, this population growth is supported by fast-growing rice. All right. In the next part of the video, we'll move on to learning about India and Africa.